Falcha, welcome back. This is part 3, Irish Granny Tarot, and we're doing Weird Scenes Inside the Canyon by David Mcgowan. I should read you the subtitle. Laurel Canyon, Covert Ops, and the Dark Heart of the Hippie Dream. Okay, we finished Phil Oakes, who really did a huge change right before he died. And now we're going to talk about a guy called Rocky Erickson, who was a front man for the 13th floor elevator. That was the name of the group. He coined the term psychedelic rock. He's given that honor. He was the first to use feedback and distortion, and his music was heavily influenced by Janis Joplin's. He formed a band with Tommy Hall, who was a psychology student, not a musician, and their purpose was to advocate for LSD and magic mushrooms, and they eventually became Scientologists. Their first 2 albums were big. April 20th, 68, he had a complete breakdown and started gibbering on stage and had to be hospitalized. He escaped to San Francisco and started getting into heroin. He went to Austin, Texas, where he was busted for 1 joint. He pled not guilty, claiming insanity, and as a result, at the age of 20, he was put in a state hospital. He tried to escape, and because of that, he was sent to a harder hospital, the Rusk State Hospital for the Criminally Insane, where he was forced to receive electroshock treatment. And shortly thereafter, he got out and formed a band. Also, while confined, he put together a prison band known as the Missing Links. One member of the band had killed 2 kids and raped and stabbed his mother. Another had been involved in the rape and murder of a young boy in Houston. A third had killed his own parents and a sibling. And then there was Rocky, who had been in possession of an insignificant amount of marijuana. So he formed his new band in 1981, and it was called Rocky Erickson and the Aliens, and it was called The Devil Is My Friend. He withdrew from public life. He became obsessed with junk mail. This is really odd. He began stealing his neighbor's junk mail, and that got him hospitalized again. In 2005, he believed he was possessed by an alien, and in 2010, he released an album, seemingly all better, toured Australia and New Zealand in 2012. And that's where we leave him. Chapter 5, Desirable People, the Canyon's Peculiar Past. And there's apparently a really good quotation here. Oh, okay. Charles R. Chuck Heath was born in March of 1938. The family lived on Farmdale Avenue near the base of Laurel Canyon, close today where Studio City is located. This is from a book by Jeffrey Dunn called The Lies of Sarah Palin. Who is Charles R. Chuck Heath, born right by Laurel Canyon? Sarah Palin's father. I thought that was funny. So, Charles Spencer Mam and his partners bought land up in a narrow road up to the crest of Lookout Mountain in 1913. And before that, Laurel Canyon was pristine wilderness. So they bought land from the base all the way to the top of the mountain in the center of Laurel Canyon, which is called Lookout Mountain. And he built a lavish inn and farm. There were stables, tennis court, golf course, ballroom. The idea being it was going to be like a country club hotel for rich people. In 1923, it burned down. In 1913, he built the first the first trackless trolley in the United States from Sunset Boulevard to the corner of Laurel Canyon Boulevard and Lookout Mountain Avenue. So he wanted to connect LA. He built a massive roadhouse at the corner there that was called the Laurel Tavern. It had a 2,000 square foot formal dining room, guest rooms, bowling alley, and it was eventually acquired by Tom Mix, the cowboy star. It later became known as the Log Cabin, Frank Zappa's house. Shortly after it was built, a rich guy built a castle, a mansion like a castle, across the street at Laurel Canyon Boulevard and Willow Glen Road. It had creepy towers, parapets, tunnels, secret passages, and hidden chambers. The grounds of the estate had trails to grottos and elaborate stone benches and hidden caves and tunnels. They marketed Laurel Canyon as a vacation destination. This roadhouse was sort of like a country club. It was advertised as a masculine retreat for wealthy men. We know what that means. The area was marketed by real estate agents as bungalow land, quote, a high-class restricted park for desirable people only. They wanted people with high wealth and low pigmentation. That wasn't in the brochure. I made that up. They had restrictive covenants to limit purchasers to white men. Photo players, this is the early version of movie stars, were very attracted to the area. But it was patrolled by violent vigilantes, white supremacists who kept out the riffraff. Very interesting to think that this, is raising its ugly head again. But at the time, in the teens and 20s, they were prevalent even in Los Angeles and in Laurel Canyon. They formed vigilante groups to keep out anybody who wasn't a rich white man. They had groups called the LA Home Guard, which were a bloodthirsty paramilitary organization. The El Monte Rangers, who thought they were kind of cowboys, and they killed Mexicans. That was their specialty. Then we have Harry Houdini, because now this is starting to attract this area. This is a little bit of the history. It's starting to attract wealthy, famous people, and odd things happen. Harry died purportedly on Halloween Day 1926 of an attack of appendicitis precipitated by a blow to the stomach. The problem with that story, however, is that medical science now recognizes it to be an impossibility. According to a recent book, The Secret Life of Houdini, he was probably murdered by poisoning. Questions have been raised, the book notes, by the curious lack of an autopsy about an experimental serum that Houdini was apparently given in the hospital, and indications that his wife Bess may have been poisoned as well, although she survived. On March 23, 2007, an exhumation of Houdini's remains was formally requested by his surviving family members, and it's unclear when or even if it will happen. Houdini's death on October 31st, 1926 came exactly 8 years after the first death to occur in what would become known as the Houdini house. And I'm just going to read this because it's an interesting narrative, and writing it out seemed kind of silly. In 1918, not long after the home was built, a lover's quarrel arose on one of the home's balconies during a Halloween birthday party. The gay lover of the original owner's son reportedly ended up splattered on the ground below. According to legend, the businessman succeeded in getting his son off the hook, but only after paying off everyone he could find to pay off, including the trial judge. The aftermath of the party proved to be a financially devastating one for the family, and the home was apparently put up for sale. Not long after that, as fate would have it, Harry Houdini was looking for a place to stay in the Hollywood area, as he had decided to break into the motion picture business. He found the perfect home in Laurel Canyon, the home that would forever after carry his name. By most accounts, he lived there from about 1919 through the early 1920s during a very brief movie career in which he starred in a handful of Hollywood films. A key scene in one of these films, The Grim Game, was reportedly shot at the top of Lookout Mountain, very near where the Lookout Inn then stood. On October 31st, 1959, precisely 33 years after Houdini's death, and 41 years after the unnamed party guest's death, the distinctive mansion on the corner of Laurel Canyon Boulevard and Willow Glen Road burned to the ground in a fire of mysterious origin. The ruins of the state remain today undisturbed for nearly 50 years. On October 31st, 1981, exactly 22 years after the fire across the road, the legendary log cabin on the other side of Laurel Canyon Boulevard also burned to the ground in yet another fire of mysterious origin. And exactly 25 years after that, October 31st, 2006, The Secret Life of Houdini was published, challenging the conventional wisdom on Houdini's death. In the 1940s, Laurel Canyon Boulevard was extended into the San Fernando Valley, connecting the two places for the first time. Lookout Mountain Lab. Let's talk about this other project in Laurel Canyon. Now, this is a building, an area that the public didn't even know about until after the millennium, after the 2000s. In 1941, it was a fortified air defense center on 2.5 acres, hidden, intentionally hidden, at the very top of Lookout Mountain in the center of Laurel Canyon. It was surrounded by electric fence. In 1947, it contained a fully operational movie studio. It was the world's only self-contained movie studio. It had 100,000 square feet floor of sound stages, screening rooms, film processing labs, editing facilities, and an animation department. They had 17 climate-controlled film vaults. They had a helicopter pad and a bomb shelter. They made over 19,000 classified movies, more than all in Hollywood ever made. It was run by the U.S. Air Force. It processed Atomic Energy Commission footage of nukes. It had advanced research and development department that was on the cutting edge of new film techniques like 3D. They developed 3D there. Famous stars were given security clearance by the government to work on undisclosed projects in this studio in Lookout Mountain. And we're not talking the cute little things you see on TV like you and the armed forces. No, these were secret. Nobody ever saw them. That wasn't special. John Ford, Jimmy Stewart, Howard Hawks, Ronald Reagan, Bing Crosby, Walt Disney, Hedda Hopper, and Marilyn Monroe were all given clearance to work at the facility on undisclosed projects, and there is no indication that any of them ever spoke of their work at the clandestine studio. Nobody knew about it for decades. There were more than 250 producers, directors, techs, editors, animators, and all of them had top secret clearance. Officially, it was closed in 1969. It's believed it remained open for other top secret stuff later than that. Its existence, I misspoke. Its existence was unknown until the early 1990s, so 10 years. And it was a rumor that the CIA had a studio there. In 1995, Peter Corrin made a documentary about the atomic bomb called Trinity and Beyond. He got all sorts of classified documentaries, and he was the first to really know about Lookout Mountain. It was a covert military facility in the heart of the epicenter of hippie counterculture. Okay, now we're going to talk about tragic figures. Nick Adams, James Dean, Dennis Hopper, Natalie Wood, all of them connected. Dean and Adams were young male prostitutes together. Didn't know that. Adams died on February 6, 1968 at the age of 36 in Coldwater Canyon, which is right next to Laurel Canyon, of an apparent suicide. Forrest Tucker said all of Hollywood knows that Nick Adams was knocked off. His private writings all disappeared from his house. It was ransacked and they all disappeared. His attorney, Erwin Roeder, discovered him dead just sitting in a chair at the age of 36. In June of 1981, Roeder and his wife were gunned down outside their Beverly Hills condo. Sal Mineo was stabbed in 1976. Robert Heinlein, the writer, graduated from where else? The U.S. Naval Academy in Annapolis. He was a naval officer. He was rabidly right-wing. He lived on Lookout Mountain Avenue. He wrote Stranger in a Strange Land, which provided a theoretical basis for the entire Manson family theory of world war. Manson named his son Valentine after the main character in Stranger in a Strange Land. Crosby quoted Heinlein often, David Crosby, and Frank Zappa quoted Heinlein often. Violence and murder were part of the canyon culture from the very beginning. Were these people intel operators posing as entertainers or from the very beginning? It's a question. No answer, just a question. We now know that there were open intelligence operations going on in the center of the canyon, and operatives going up and down the mountain every day to work 20 years before the first rock star ever got there. Here's another little quote. Let's suppose, hypothetically speaking, that you happen to be Jim Morrison and have recently arrived in Laurel Canyon, and now you find yourself fronting a band that's on the verge of taking the country by storm. And just a mile or so down Laurel Canyon Boulevard from you lives another guy who also recently arrived in Laurel Canyon and who also happens to front a band on the verge of stardom. He happens to be married to a girl that you attended kindergarten with, and her dad, like yours, was involved in atomic weapons research and testing. Admiral George Morrison for a time did classified work at White Sands. Her husband's dad, meanwhile, is involved in another type of research, chemical warfare. This other guy's business partner manager is a spooky ex-Marine who just happens to have a cousin who, bizarrely enough, also fronts a rock band on the verge of superstardom. And this third rock star on the rise also happens to live in Laurel Canyon, just a mile or two from your house. Just down a couple of other streets, also within walking distance, live two other kids who, wouldn't you know it, also happen to front a new rock and roll band. These two kids happen to attend the same Alexandria, Virginia high school that you attended, and one of them also attended Annapolis, just like your dad did, and just like your kindergarten friend's dad did. Though almost all of you hail from Washington, D.C., you now find yourselves in the opposite side of the country in an isolated canyon high above the city of Los Angeles, where you all are clustered around a secret military installation. Given his background in research on atomic weapons, your father is probably familiar to some extent with the existence and operations of Lookout Mountain Laboratory, as is the father of your kindergarten friend. The question that naturally arises here, I suppose, is this: what do you suppose the odds are that all of that just came together purely by chance? How many coincidences does it take to make a conspiracy? We'll have to ask the cards. Jim Morrison, by the way, not only did he not decry his father's involvement in the Gulf of Tonkin or in White Sands, but he told everybody his parents were dead. And January of 1964, just months before he left to become a rock star, he took a photo with his father on the bridge of the USS Bonhomme Richard. And it took decades, 4 decades, for the truth of the fact of his family origins and the fact that his parents were both alive. It took decades for it to surface at all. Chapter 6, Vito and His Freakers, the sinister roots of hippie culture. Oh, this is really interesting. And kind of gross. There's a lot of really disturbing stuff that went on at that time. Crosby's autobiography ignores important people like Victor Polikas and his freakers who got the birds together. He was the first hippie. He and his group were the first hippies. Vito and his wife, Sue, and then their friends, Captain Fuck, and a band of 35 dancers. My husband says he saw them in LA. They lived semi-communally. They had big old orgies, and they did free-form dancing. And I'm sure that you've seen many, many times in various different movies and shows, the screen will be a scrim, kind of a see-through screen, and you'll see the shadowy silhouettes of young women dancing, and there's psychedelic colors and patterns going on in the background, and then they're doing all this free-form bizarre dancing to this loud psychedelic music. That was Vito and his freakers, which is what the hippies were called before they were called hippies. They their purpose, okay, they had their little communal thing going on, and it had its own purpose, but their purpose became to entice audiences into the Sunset Strip nightclubs, which didn't exist until all of this stuff existed. So he got the Byrds together. Chris Hillman, Barry Miles, who was the drummer for Love, they were some of the first hippies. Ray Manzarek in the Doors. They were led by a guy called Vitantus Alfonso Paulikas, who was born to Lithuanian immigrants in Massachusetts in May of 1913. He spent time in juvenile reform school, and in 1938 he was convicted of armed robbery. He got 25 years for holding up a theater. And in 1942 he was released into the Merchant Marines. It was the war, you know. In the end of the war, he was released into the public, and in 46 he went to LA. In 48, this is interesting. In 1948, Winthrop Rockefeller, 35, married Eva Sears, Vito's cousin. So Vito was the first cousin to the Rockefellers by marriage. Eva's parents were not invited to the wedding because she was related to Vito, and that family wasn't high tone enough for the Rockefellers. He had married a teenager in the 1930s and married again and had children in the 1950s, and married a third time to Sue at 48 when she was 18. He made a living teaching clay modeling to rich Beverly Hills ladies and people like Jonathan Winters, Mickey Rooney, and Steve Allen. And his clay modeling, they were often, human figures. That's all I'll say. His partner, Carl Franzoni, was related to carvers of Masonic monuments of Washington, D.C., like directly related in a long line of famous stonemasons, famous Freemasons, and talked about it all the time, is why it's even mentioned. Kim Fowley made a record with Zappa's future wife, Gail. Fowley was born in 1939, went to a military academy, grew up in Malibu with a bunch of actors and guys from the Navy. He was a young street hustler. He joined the Army National Guard, and in 1957 formed a band, Sleepwalker, with the Beach Boys' Bruce Johnson. Sometimes Phil Spector played with them. They produced the songs Alley Oop and Papa Mau Mau, and he worked with the Byrds in the background. He formed the Runaways in 1975 with an underage underage teenage girls who later claimed that he demanded sex from them in order to be in the band. He produced in 1969 Gene Vincent, an album with Linda Ronstadt on the vocals, and 2 years later Vincent died. His promoter was Don Arden, the father of Sharon Osbourne. In 1964, there was suddenly just this explosion of clubs on the Sunset Strip, the Whiskey A Go-Go, who was owned by Elmer Valentine, who was a mobbed-up cop, a vice cop from Chicago. In 1964, Ciro's was redone. It had been owned by Bugsy Siegel. In 1965, the guy who did that also opened up the Trip, and in 1965, the Ciro's were the first to play the Byrds. There were lots of new bands: the Doors, the Byrds, Buffalo Springsteen, Love, the Turtles, the Mothers of Invention, Mamas and the Papas, the Lovin' Spoonful. None was very good live. None of these bands was very good live. They not only were they not good performing live, but they didn't play on their own vinyl studio recordings. They had session musicians, the Wrecking Crew, Phil Spector's Wall of Sound guys. They did all the instrumentals and a lot of the vocals in these bands. And this is not disputable. They all talk about it. How did they get an audience? Well, they had the Freak Squad come, and these almost naked girls, like 35 almost naked girls, gyrating all over the place. They put the music on really, really loudly. put on all the bright lights, the psychedelic lights, got everybody really wasted, and nobody cared how they sounded. The real show was the dancers. The band did not have to be good. And this is a theme that's repeated over and over by the musicians, by the managers, by the producers, by the record company owners. Just everybody says the same thing. So chapter 7, this chapter is hard. The death of Godo Palicus angers infant Lucifer. And we're talking Kenneth Anger, who was an occultist, a Satanist, a pedophile, a weirdo, a pervert, and a movie maker. So Vito would come in every night with an entourage, mostly 4 or 5 really great-looking girls. It's a weird parallel, but it was like a nonviolent Manson situation, a little cult. This is Lou Adler, the manager and producer of the Mamas and the Papas, the co-organizer of the Monterey Pop Festival, the investor in J. Sebring's hair business, and the business partner of mobster club owner Elmer Valentine. And then we have, quote, I have said for years that there are some similarities between Vito of the Freaks and Manson. Vito was sort of like a pimp. He was welcome as a VIP with the emerging rock crowd, but because he always showed up with these free-thinking 14 and 15-year-old girls that would be happy to satisfy their needs. This is from the member of the Palicus family in an email correspondence with the author of the book. Vito ran a crash pad for runaways, and he also moved girls into the log cabin. So there was this just gigantic spreading orgy / commune / God knows what, and many, many, many runaway teenagers. At one point, 36 people lived in the log cabin, including Timothy Leary, who had his own log cabin home, Laurel Canyon home, but preferred to be at the log cabin with everybody. Ravi Shankar, George Harrison, and then all the rest that we mentioned before. When the commune moved out in 1968, all these freaks and everything, Zappa moved in, and Carl Franzoni stayed. So this weird Vito lived in the log cabin first and had this huge commune going on. Well, first it was owned by Tom Mix. Franzoni moved in, Vito and Franzoni moved in with all these girls, the freaks. They eventually moved out and went to greener pastures, and when they did, Frank Zappa moved in. And Frank Zappa had a revolving door for everybody in Laurel Canyon. Godo. Who was Godo? Godo was Vito's 3-year-old son, not quite 3-year-old son, and he died tragically, and the circumstances of his death are to this day still unknown. There are many conflicting stories, but the basic outline is they were doing a photo session. He was the poster child for the hippie movement, and he was beautiful too, and he was going to be the star, this is really disturbing, of Kenneth Anger's movie, something about Lucifer, Child of Lucifer. I have it written down. I'll get to it and say it correctly. But they were going to make him the star of this movie, and they were doing a photo shoot on the roof of a building. And this child fell through a skylight on the roof and died. But there are all sorts of rumors that that was the excuse, but the reality is that he was drugged on LSD. No proof. This is all theory. It happened at 7:30 p.m. on December 23rd, 1966. Now, here's why that's significant. Your not quite 3-year-old child dies suddenly and tragically in a horrifying accident the night before Christmas Eve. What do? Well, I'll tell you what Vito and Sue did. They went out partying. Accusations of child sexual abuse with these underage girls in the group were made, and the whole group, Vito and a whole bunch of them, fled to Haiti and then to Jamaica, out of the reach of American authorities. It was actually Haiti that Vito appears to have fled to, and then to Jamaica, which at the time had no extradition treaty with the U.S., accompanied by his wife Sue and their new baby daughter. Now, this is her name. I'm not making this up, and this would be one reason why this is disturbing. Her name was Groovy Nipples Polikas, born in 1967. The couple would have several more offspring, each given an increasingly ridiculous name. BP Polikas, Sky Polikas, born bizarrely enough on Godot's 8th birthday. Freakus Magikus Polikas, who was born a little more than a year before the couple divorced in March of 1975 in Northern California. These people are crazy. Entertainment purposes only. Zappa moved into the log cabin for a long time, and that whole scene occurred, as we talked about. But right around the time of the Tate murders, for some unknown reason, Zappa moved into a high-security home on Woodrow Wilson Drive, surrounded by electrified fences. The Manson family had begun to form in Laurel Canyon around this group in Zappa's log cabin home. And we read the similarities already about them. David Crosby, let's see. David Crosby used to run around in a cape. So, well, here's a little list. This is actually pretty interesting. Vito considered himself to be a gifted artist and poet, as did our friend Charlie Manson. Vito, according to Miles, was something of a guru. Miles is the writer of another book, as was quite obviously Charlie Manson. Vito surrounded himself with a flock of very young, often underage women, ditto. Vito was considerably older than his followers, as was Charlie. When Vito addressed his flock, they listened with rapt attention as though they were being delivered the word of God, as was true with Manson, too. Carl Franzoni was known to wear a black cape and refer to himself as Captain Fuck, while Manson was also partial to black capes and would at times declare himself to be the god of fuck. Vito is said to have had a virtually insatiable libido, as did, by numerous reports, Charlie Manson. Vito's flock adopted nicknames to aid in the depersonalization process, as did the Manson family. Vito's troupe included a Beverly Hills hairstylist named Sheldon Jamin, while Charlie's included a Beverly Hills hairpiece stylist named Charles Watson. Vito believed in introducing children to sexuality at a very young age, while in the Manson family, infant sexuality was encouraged. Vito apparently liked to stage live sex shows for his followers involving underage participants, which was also a specialty of Charles Manson. Finally, Vito encouraged his followers to drug themselves while he himself largely abstained, thus enabling him at all times to maintain control, while Manson limited his own drug intake for the very same reason. And like a group that we'll talk about later in the book, the Process Church, David Crosby had taken to wearing an Oscar Wilde, Frank Lloyd Wright cape wherever he went. So things are getting odd. The Process Church, here we go, of the Final Judgment, one of the most controversial cults of the 60s, formed in 1963 in London as an offshoot of Scientology, and was begun by Robert Moore and Marianne McLean, who was a madam, like literally a madam, ran a brothel. They came to the United States in 1968 to LA, San Francisco, and New Orleans, New York, and Boston. They established branches. They wrote a magazine celebrating Satan, Hitler, and Gore. Marianne Faithfull said that it was very much like fascism, and they used a swastika, and they were a death-worshipping church. And there's some association with them and potentially the Son of Sam murders, and I have not paid attention to that, but that's a little promise for the future here. They're directly connected to Manson and possibly the Son of Sam. They wore black capes. Zappa was a ringleader, like Vito, ran a tight ship on his little group of freaky people. Zappa's biography, his daughter, Frank's daughter Moon Unit, recalls men with straggling beards, body odor, and bad posture who crouched naked near her playthings. Also, the Zappa children watched porn with their parents and were encouraged in their own sexuality as soon as they reached puberty. When they became teenagers, Gail insisted they shower with their overnight guests in order to conserve water. Apparently, Frank Zappa was having a hard time paying his Department of Water and Power bill. So Poligas returned to Northern California and ended up, get this, teaching dance at Sonoma State College. Franzini was a dancer on The Gong Show with Chuck Barris, who claimed that he had been a CIA assassin. In the 1970s, Eric Burden lived in the log cabin, and he called it creepy. And if Eric Burden calls something creepy, you better believe it. It burned down on Halloween in 1981. Vito Poligas died, and his memorial was on Halloween in 1992. And there's a real story in here about Godot's death, but I'm not going to read it. It's very disturbing. And now we're at chapter 8, and I will stop here. So this is the end of part 3. And we'll get to part 4 here as soon as part 3 uploads. And Sláinte. Thank you for listening.